Hello and welcome to Grumpy Old Crone with me, Annie. I'm going to be having, as usual, a good old whinge about things that don't matter very much in the witchcraft and pagan communities for the next half an hour, give or take. Now, I've got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to dive straight into the very first section for today, which is existing whilst witchy. I'm also going to drink some of my tea. So, last week I did a couple of videos, one of my normal weekly videos like this, and a homebrew teaching vlog filmed on my iPhone about some of the autumnal jobs and workings that I'm doing at the moment. Now, the teaching vlogs never get the same kind of push and engagement from YouTube, so I tend to think that people don't like them quite as much, and consequently I don't do as many, which means that, I was actually really happy when quite a lot of people contacted me last week to say that they did like the video. It had fewer views on the whole, but people really seemed to vibe with my kind of low-key way of doing things. And this is what I wanted to address in this section today. These teaching videos seem low-key and achievable because that's exactly what they are, and exactly what I personally think witchcraft and paganism in day-to-day life should be. There are so many, Insta profiles, TikTok channels, YouTube channels and so forth, all of which are peddling this brilliant, shiny concept of aesthetically beautiful witchcraft. You know the sort, I'm positive. Even if you've only just spent like 10 minutes browsing under the keyword witchy on any of the visual social media sites. They're full of women. I mean, why? Why is it always women? I'm not sure why. There are male witches, quite a lot of them. But anyway, it's usually full of women. They've always got perfectly done makeup, perfect salon-ready nails, flawless clothes, and they're always filling beautiful bowls of vast amounts of expensive herbs, usually with a bit of, God bless her, Florence and the Machine going on in the background. They're setting fire to artisanal candles and using their incense to create a sunlight, smoke-filled filter look. It's all very beautiful, but who the hell does all of that all of the time? After more than, 4 decades of practicing, I do have access to a lot of attractive looking tools and stuff. I've made a habit of charity shop hunting, looking for nice things. So if I want to fill a pretty bowl with an entire summer's worth of lavender, I could do that. And it would look great for a video or a short. And, hopefully I would then be able to earn enough from that video and short to buy and replace some farmed lavender to replace what I'd used in that single video. But, isn't that just a bit counterintuitive? Couldn't we just, maybe use less? Concentrate on working energetically rather than it having to look like, I hate that phrase, an Instagrammable moment. I guess what I'm saying here is that if you want to practice witchcraft, don't think that those beautiful videos are anything other than, inspirational little bits of cheery content. You don't have to make your workings look like that in order for them to work. Just because somebody has put an attractive filter on their 30-second video of them lighting a candle and making some esoteric gestures with their tattooed fingers, no hate here, I really want to get my fingers tattooed, but I can't afford it right now. But that doesn't make it any more authentic than me crawling under a rosebush last week with a hammer and an iron nail that was covered in my dog's cremains. I didn't look very attractive whilst I was doing it, to be fair, but I do think it reflects the reality of witchcraft a lot better than a beautifully shot and curated thing that is done simply and only for the camera. Being a witch isn't just about those moonlit moments by standing stones with Heilung playing in the background. I mean, those are nice if you get them, don't get me wrong, and if you don't have a couple of similarly emotional moments a year, then maybe you should look at doing something nice for yourself, because you deserve to have some of that in your life. But it's also, and mostly, I find, about the single card oracle pull of a morning, or putting on your favourite crystal necklace, or washing your front door and chalking a sigil under the mat so as not to freak out the postman, just like last week. It's about growing a plant from a seed, talking to it, watering it, picking it, drying it, and using it in your next ritual. It's about having a bit of go at incense blending if you fancy, or maybe treating yourself to a £2 bottle of essential oil once a month. handy tip, I use Nakura. They do £2 Tuesdays, which is fabulous for building a collection when you don't have a lot of money. I'll try and remember to leave a link. But it's about making it part of your everyday life, basically, in an everyday way. You don't need to be wearing a big pointy hat or spooky contact lenses. You just need to believe in it and find a home for it in your heart every single day. Now, I've met a lot of witches over the course of my life, and without question, the ones who've struck me as the most authentic and raw and powerful are the ones who just quietly go around their everyday lives with their practice and their beliefs as the centre point around which everything else rotates. They don't wear clothes covered with witchy symbols. I mean, handy hint, those are goths, and they're also lovely. Not always pagans, not always witches. Assume nothing, ask, be polite, and they don't generally feel the need to, preach about the joys and the power of Baphomet whilst they're walking their dog. They're not attempting to be edgy, dark and mysterious. They're just living their lives, hoovering their carpet, buying the carrots, doing the school run and, hexing the patriarchy whilst the pasta boils. So I am going to keep on doing the grumpy old crone teaches homebrew videos, whilst also realising that they aren't necessarily what everyone wants to see. But I think there's probably enough people interested that it's worth my while to carry on. The next one, fingers crossed, is going to be the basics of casting a circle when you live in a small space like this. But I need to tidy my office first because it's a bit of a disaster zone, and I would dearly love you to all carry on erroneously believing that my house is actually clean and tidy, so I need to sort that out. Anyway, thank you for listening to that bit. So we are now going to move on to the meat and 2 potatoes of today. Now, I've got my big flame-proof knickers ready, just so that you know. So the question we're going to address today is your pet your familiar? Now, before I even finish that first sentence here, I know that this is going to be a really divisive subject. For all those who are going to disagree violently with me, I am apologising up front. I don't think for a hot second that people are just going to go, oh, what an interesting and opposing thought to my own, and move on. Because this addresses something that most of us feel incredibly strongly about, and that is our pets. Now, I've had pets all my life, right from my very first guinea pig, who I got when I was 6, who turned out to be almost immortal in guinea pig years, much to my mother's horror, who had been expecting a guinea pig to last about 2 to 3 years max. But that guinea pig actually made it to be 9. Anyway, sorry, digression. As I was saying, from that very first guinea pig up to my current crop of cats and chickens, I have always loved being around animals in one way or another. I think my peak pet keeping was probably about 15 years ago. I had a dog, 3 cats actually, about 20 chickens, 4 ducks and 2 guinea pigs. Loved them all dearly. Now, my life altered when Mr. Grumpy Old Crone and I got together and we started travelling and going to events, which made looking after animals a little bit more difficult. Happily, my kids were young adults at this point and very happy to house sit and to look after the various pets whilst we were away. But as time went on, children grew up as they do, and now they have their own homes and their own lives, and it's become harder to find pet sitters. So, as my merry little band of creatures inevitably made their way into the hereafter, we didn't replace them. I mean, we adopted Dion and Doreen, the teapot bantam chickens, because they needed to be somewhere more enclosed, because apparently, according to their last owner, they are the Houdinis of the chicken world, and I have a tall walled gardens, and I love having them. And they're so tiny, they don't really require much looking after apart from a weekly refill on food and water and some cuddles. My cats are definitely ageing. They're 15 now, and I think Jinx is probably on his final hurrah before the end. Don't worry, my very nearly daughter-in-law is a fully qualified vet. She's done all the checks, has had the best care, but sometimes age is a cruel bastard, and I don't imagine we'll still have Jinx this time next year. I do refuse to mourn now. It's time for that later. This is the time for chicken off my plate and a few prawns when his brother isn't looking, basically. But I say all of this just to make it clear that I have animals and I love animals. I've always had animals. But I don't believe they are my familiars. Now, about 50% of the people watching this are now shouting at the screen, and I'm sorry about that. Yeah, it's a thing. So, But I really, really don't believe that my pets are anything other than my pets. Have I had pets who've shown really weird and human-like behaviour? Yes, I have. My late cat, Cthulhu, don't judge me, love the writing of Lovecraft. I know he was a terrible person, but still, Cthulhu. Anyway, Thu, he was like a little person. A little fluffy person. I got him from the rescue centre when he was 5 weeks old. He was far too young to be removed from his mother, but the shitty human whose house he was rescued from was very literally flushing kittens down the toilet, and it was a case of take him or he dies. I still hope the person who pulled the chain on Thu's sister is either miserable or dead, because there's no hope for some people. I'm not an advocate of violence, but yeah. But anyway, Thu, he was amazing. He went for walks with me. He demonstrably recognised quite a few key words in English. He knew when I was sad or grieving and refused to leave me. He acted as a guard cat for both of my children, standing alert in their cots while they slept. He walked them both to school in the morning, returned home, slept, went back to pick them up at the end of the school day. He got the timing better than I did. He was an amazing cat. But he was a cat. He was also the first of my pets to return after death, because he was very old when he passed, 22 I think. He had arthritis in his paws and he couldn't retract his claws. The sound of him padding across my tile floor in the kitchen and the dining room was unmistakable and really, really loud, and I heard it for quite a few weeks after he passed. But he was an amazing cat, not a flesh suit for a familiar spirit. He was one of the best cats I've ever known, and I will miss him all the time until the day I take my last breath. But I'm always interested by the thought process of people who refer to their pets as their familiars, and I think there are a few ways of looking at it. Number one, it's an aesthetically witch-centric way of saying how important they are to you. The majority of human society sees animals as somehow less than humans, and humans as somehow separate from nature. By naming animals as familiars, a witch reclaims that deep, loving and equal bond with their animal. It's a useful word that conveys to mundanes that your pet is deeply important to you and a part of your family. Two, it's a cute sort of TikTok thing. People who want to look witchy with the right aesthetic, they get a cat. It's always a cat with these people. Nobody ever has, I don't know what, like a wasp as a familiar if they're on TikTok, do they? No, it's always a cat, always a black cat. Three, people genuinely believe that their pets are familiars. I'm a little bit lost with this one, to be fair. Surely you must know that your French bulldog doesn't travel to other people's houses, lay curses and then return, that you don't feed them on your own blood, that they aren't immortal, that they can't travel through solid walls and barred windows. I mean, the more I think about it, the more I reckon that people who seem to believe that their cat is genuinely their familiar don't actually know much about what a familiar is or does. They want to claim the title, they don't actually understand it. How many people are shouting at the screen right now? Lovely. I thought so. Let's carry on. Because none of those things actually qualify your pet as a familiar. That's not what familiar is. We do have lots of resources that tell us what a familiar is, and lots of those resources were not written by witches. They were written by people who tortured witches, or, to be more accurate, they were written by people who tortured women and invented things with which to accuse them of being witches. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this subject. I'm pretty sure that most people out there can Google and read books just as well as I can, and I'll admit that I had to look quite a bit of this up. It's not just living rent-free in my head, unfortunately. Fortunately, I'm not sure. But here's what I found in terms of what a familiar actually is and some of the timeline that's involved in it. The earliest mention I found was in William of Malmesbury's Gesta Regum Angelorum, which was written about 1853. He talks about a woman who practices divination by interpreting the flight of birds and who dies and is taken away from her super secure tomb and carried away by a demonic horse. I haven't been able to find the original Old English of this section, just modern translations, so I can't speak as to the historic use of the word familiar in the original manuscript. My Old English is a bit rough. Anyway, If you don't know what I'm talking about, we're talking a few centuries before Chaucer. So, it's not like reading a copy of 50 Shades of Grey. But the best translation of the story that I found mentions that the witch kept a crow as a familiar who spoke to her in English and foretold her death. I think we can agree that our cats don't generally tend to speak to us in English much. Well, mine doesn't, does yours? Anyway, literature then seems to skip forward to the early modern period, which is when the by now infamous witch trials were launched with murderous fervour. In 1486, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, was published, and thereafter was used to justify the persecution of thousands and thousands of women. Well, people, but mostly women. This infamous book mentions familiars a lot, but the familiars are always active participants in magic. They talk, they have to be magically summoned, they do physically impossible tasks for their witches, things like milking the neighbour's cows and magically transporting the milk back home in a bucket. Can your cat do that? Mine can't. Be jolly handy if he could. But during the early modern period, we also see the publication of many pamphlets that accompany the persecution and trials of witches, and this is where the conversation about familiar spirits really entrenches itself. But can we really trust these confessions? We know now that torture just doesn't work in terms of extracting trustworthy confessions. A person in pain or distress will say literally anything to make that situation stop. Even if you make the truly stupid assumption that the confessions are true, then you are still faced with the fact that familiars are seen to be very active magical participants in their masters' and mistresses' workings. They aren't just pets. And as we travel forward in time, we get to the really interesting case of Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witches, which was published in 1584. It has one of the best and longest subtitles I've ever encountered, and it reads thus. Right. Proving the common opinions of witches contracting with divils, spirits or their familiars, and their power to kill, torment and consume the bodies of men, women and children or other creatures by diseases or otherwise, their flying in the air, etc., to be but imaginary, erroneous conceptions and novelties, wherein also the lewd unchristian practices of witchmongers upon aged, melancholy, ignorant and superstitious people in extorting confessions by inhumane terrors and tortures is notably detected, whereunto is added a treatise upon the nature and substance of spirits and devils, etc. Bloody hell, that's a mouthful. Now, if that just kind of ran across your ears as a sort of mad word salad, I will point out that the most important part of that whole subtitle is the bit where it calls them erroneous conceptions and novelties. This book, published at the height of the Elizabethan New Rational Age, is calling out the whole idea of witches killing people, flying, consorting with spirits and more. He's saying it's all complete tosh. He is one of the first people to call out something that we are still shouting about now, and that is that just torture being inflicted on old, depressed, ill-educated and superstitious people. It's a really bloody important work, and it breaks my heart that it was published in 1584, and yet the worst of the witch persecutions was still to follow just 60 years later in the UK. Now, Matthew Hopkins, may he suffer for all eternity in any kind of hell that he actually believed in, he was a mass murderer, having killed 300 people in just 2 years. As an Essex girl, one of these days I'll do a proper video on just what happened in East Anglia. It was horrific. He used James I's demonology to justify his murderous rampage. And let's be clear here, James I of England had absolutely zero understanding or experience of witchcraft. He was a deeply insecure man with absolute power, trying to make sense of a world in which he felt hated and threatened. He wrote a book about hating and torturing women, and he blamed them for every bad thing that happened to him. I mean, yeah, okay, that's a bit of a sweeping generalisation, but I kind of stand by it. Between James I and Matthew Hopkins, a bloodbath ensued. But even within the context of this hated book, familiars are not just pets. James talks about how familiars can conjure up food for their witches and how they operate on a kind of tit-for-tat kind of a turnaround. The witch needed to feed them with her own blood from an imaginary teat somewhere on her body. This was generally held to be like a mole or a birthmark or a burst blood vessel. Anything, anywhere on a woman's body that was not absolutely perfect. Now, I don't know about you, but, you know, I've got moles all over me. I've got lumps and bumps and skin tags because I'm not a flawless teenager. Most of us over the age of 20 were pretty much the same, I'll guess. And if they didn't find a devil's teat immediately, then they'd look more closely and more intimately. Until the torture of just that alone will be enough to drive a modest woman to confess. But here's the thing. Even when the proof required was so incredibly spurious, the accusers still held true to the familiars being magical. So not even Matthew Hopkins thought that Mr. Tiddles your cat was a familiar. Now, if I carry on with this up until the point of modern day and how the modern views of familiars and spirit workings has changed, well, you'll need a 3-course meal and a duvet before I get finished. So let's just skip ahead, right, and leave that for another day. Literally nobody thought that a normal pet was a familiar. They may have made up a story that they saw Mr. Tiddles milking their best cow, but if they did that, they acknowledged that he was much more than a normal cat. And this has held true until the present day. And frankly, I'm a bit confused by that. By claiming that a normal pet is a familiar, it A, completely devalues the actual energetic and magical work of familiar summoning. Now, I do believe it is very much possible, but it's not giving Mr. Tiddles a kipper for his supper, let's be honest. But B, it also devalues the bond that you have with another species. Honestly, the fact that we can have cross-species conversation about, yes, you are a very good dog, yes, you are, nose boob, it's amazing. And C, by claiming something that is patently, obviously untrue, it just makes everybody else look just that bit less credible. And for what it's worth, I do believe that familiars are 100% credible. I was brought up about 25 miles away from the village of Canewden, which has a strong living witchcraft tradition, but one which very rarely gets looked at in the literature. The witches of Canewden were famed for having white mice as familiars, and there are living memory first-person stories of these mice carrying out the witches' bidding around the village, you know, just kind of all running out as a pack. There's also the story that these familiars needed to be passed on willingly to the next person in the line before the witch is allowed to die, which feels, I don't know, kind of energetically correct to me. Canewden is one of those places that I really need to do a video on, but I need to do a bit of travelling and sneaky photography, as Canewden isn't a big place, and I don't want to really irritate and annoy people or get any grief about it either. But the interesting thing here is that the familiars claimed openly by witches in Canewden are not the usual cat, dog, toad shebang. They're a horde of white mice. Why would anybody have those just hanging about? I mean, loads of people have cats and dogs, and if you've got a garden, then encouraging toads who eat slugs and bugs, well, that's just common sense, isn't it? But mice? And let's not forget the cat, dog, toad thing was usually mentioned in those torture-extracted confessions we talked about, which leads me to suspect that this was the mundane's vision of what a familiar looked like. If we look at witchcraft books and grimoires, etc., we can see that witches who are not under threat of pain and death talk about using a much greater range of creatures. Wasps, flies, mice, goats, all of them useful in their own ways. How many times have you said, oh, I wish I could be a fly on the wall during that conversation? Well, maybe a witch could. Or at least send a fly to view and then, you know, report back. So when you think about familiars, try to widen your expectations, and please, for the love of little green apples, let's please forget the completely pointless Harry Potter concept of a familiar. What were those creatures meant to have done anyway? What point were they? They were literally just pets that those children had. I tried to think how many children begged with their parents for owls or rats or toads, which were then horrifically neglected. If only the parents had encouraged the children to summon their own demons. I'm only kidding. Well, half kidding. Actually, I think maybe I need to think about that a bit more. Now, I reckon by now about half the viewers will have turned off in incandescent anger at me. They'll all be they'll all be doing away with their subscriptions by me because I'm suggesting that their pet isn't a real familiar. But if you're still here, thank you. If you're only here because you haven't got around to unsubscribing yet, I've got to break it to you. I am grumpy and I am judgmental, and this is one of those situations. So, you know, better unsubscribe, sorry. Finally, my very last word on this subject is, if you want to know if I do have a familiar, the answer is kind of. If you've watched my videos for a while, you'll know that I often talk about my bubach, my house spirit, or domovoi, grandfather. He's not a cat, he's a spirit. He appears around the house, I feed him offerings, he finds contact lenses most of the time. He helps us protect the house and will occasionally materialise tiny gifts for us. He's the closest that I have to a familiar, but he doesn't really do the same work as a familiar. But he is a spirit, and a spirit who takes physical form sometimes. But he's not really a familiar in the proper sense of the word. Am I interested in working with familiars in the future? Well, maybe. I mean, I'm more interested in constructed thought forms like tulpas, but I've done next to nothing short of some reading and basic research about it. Maybe one of these days I'll do it and I'll talk through my work on here. Who knows? Anyway, I have witted on far too much. And I did notice a comment on the last video that said, "You talk too much," which, whilst not incorrect, did make me wonder what she was expecting from a half-hour video that had been labelled up front to be about half an hour of whinging. I know, maybe some interpretative dance. You never can tell with people. Anyway, enough of this. On we go with something that will hopefully not make people send me death threats on behalf of Spot the Dog and Mr. Tiddles. Here comes the positive bit. Here comes the positive bit. Oh, it's gone cold. Anyway, I'm going to do a recommendation positive for today because we haven't had one of those for a little while now. So today's book recommendation is Hex by Jenny Fagan. Now, I got this from my local library, who I use almost exclusively for audiobooks, because when my borrowing time is up, it just disappears from my phone and I don't get overdue fines, which is just great by me. Thank you very much. I tend to forget things like that, and that can get expensive. So I didn't know what to expect from this book because I literally checked it out based on the title. You can afford to do that when it's a library book, I find. So Hex is an account of the last 24 hours of the convicted witch, Gellis Duncan. Now, you may have come across that name in the TV series Outlander, a series which someone once attempting to belittle it by calling it porn for middle-aged women, to which I replied, yes, and your problem with that is? Let's just say Sam Heughan in a kilt is a pleasing thing. Anyway, sorry, back to the recommendation. Gellis Duncan was not just a character in a book. She was a very real person, a young girl, probably a young teenager of 14, 15, 16, and she was horrifically tortured and forced to confess to the most improbably false accusations. We don't know much about her because her accusers and murderers didn't bother to tell us anything about the very real person. They preferred to dwell on the horrors to which she was subjected. Her crime? She left her master's house in the evening and liked to help people who felt ill, and sometimes that help made them feel better. That's it. And for that, her head was shaved and crushed with a rope. Her fingers and thumbs were smashed with thumbscrews, and she was subjected to a violent and intimate search for a witch's mark. And finally, she was hung. No long drop for Gellis. She had a long, slow death of strangulation hanging in 1591. It is horrific. And the book Hex gives her back her humanity. Whether there is a thread of accuracy in there or not, it allows us to see her as a person, and that's so powerful when looking at those murdered during the witch trials. I recommend the audiobook if you can get it, as the reader is Scottish and the accent absolutely helps to portray the people involved. It's one of those books that is going to stay with me for a very, very long time. My second recommendation is going to be prefixed by me saying that I do have a very particular taste in films. I love dreamy, unsettling folk horror type films when you aren't quite sure what the hell is going on. If you're more of a Tom Cruise battles bad guys and kisses a girl kind of a person, then maybe you want to give this one a miss. But if you loved, I know, Midsommar and The Wicker Man and particularly Dev Patel's The Green Knight, then this just might be for you. It's Gretel and Hansel. It stars one of my favourite actresses, Alice Krieger, as Hulda the Witch, and I really loved the nuanced approach to an old fairy tale. I won't spoil it by saying much more than that, but if you like weird, dreamy films that feature folktales and witchcraft, this could be a great weekend watch. Now, I spotted it on Amazon Prime Video in the UK, but obviously that's going to alter according to what country you're in and what streaming services you have access to. So I'm going to leave you there. But before I do, I'm going to send you off with my usual blessing. So, as the weather softens into the golden glow of autumn, so may your heart be open to receive the joys and rewards of your work throughout the year. Blessed be my friends and cronies.